Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we got to look into the final days of Brian Epstein from the biography about Brian entitled The Man Who Made the Beatles. And we found out that Brian didn't mean to end his life. He just took one too many pills by accident. So now we're going to delve in a little bit more about Brian, and then we'll start in his younger years. So Brian was at his ninth school by the time he was 13. He went to Wrekin College. It was a traditional school for 340 boys. The new headmaster, Reverend Guy Pendrith, discouraged rivalry between school houses. He felt there was too much emphasis on sport and not enough attention paid to the arts, and music was encouraged. It should have been the perfect place for Brian, but he thought the school's wind of change blew too slowly for him. He was placed in Bailey House, and he wasted no time telling the boys how to pronounce his last name. It is not Epstein, it's Epstein. The headmasters gave Brian the nickname Eppie. Brian didn't like the school uniform of black jacket and gray trousers. He wasn't lazy, but the other students thought he wasn't interested in studies. His letters to his parents gave the feeling he was marking time until his education ended. Sunday evenings were devoted to model making. For an hour and a half, boys were encouraged to try their hand at doing something constructive. Sunday evenings were devoted to model making. For an hour and a half, boys were encouraged to try their hand at doing something constructive. Brian didn't want anything to do with it. He was popular with the boys at school. Peter Ward remembered that on Sunday afternoon record sessions, with an old wind-up gramophone in one of the temporary classrooms at the college, he said we played mostly hits from the 1940s and discussed the artists in detail. And Brian would speak proudly of Jewish contributions to music. On the sports field, Brian was hopeless. After most games, the team would be mud-splattered, but Brian looked as elegant as he did before the game, and his rugby sports laces were still white. He used aftershave and rode out the teasing he got from doing it. He spent a lot of time combing his hair and debated whether he needed a haircut. It was said by the other students that Brian shone on the school stage. In and out of the classroom, Brian would sketch fashions. His mother said that Brian did not like school from the start. Brian's parents were Queenie Hyman and Harry Epstein, and they married when Queenie was 18 and Harry was 29. They were married at the synagogue on Wilson Road, Sheffield, on September 6, 1933. The couple met on holiday at St. Anne's-on-the-Sea. The wedding was the union of two industrious and flourishing furniture firms. Harry worked with his father Isaac in the shop, which the latter had opened in Walton Street, Liverpool, in 1901. A penniless immigrant, Queenie's family owned the Sheffield Cabinet Company, whose most commercial product, the Clarendon bedroom suit, adored thousands of British homes. Queenie was bookish and a shy young girl, and she loved the arts, books, music, and the theater. Harry made sure his father's business thrived. He became a successful furniture retailer when he and Queenie moved to Liverpool upon their marriage, and they moved into a newly built house in the suburb of Childwell. Their address was 197 Queens Drive. It was spacious and comfortable. There were 5 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Inside were heavy oak panel walls and huge, handsome stained glass mural colored maroon, green, and blue, in observation of the Jewish law. And on the doorpost of each room rested a small mezuzah, the wood-encased scroll of the Jewish law that Brian's grandfather, Louis Hyman, had provided to mark his daughter's new home. Off the hall was the morning room where Brian would in later years sit with John Lennon planning the Beatles' future. In the spacious lounge, the Epstein family hosted a cocktail party for Paul on his 21st birthday. Upstairs to the right was Brian's room. It overlooked Queens Drive, and as a teenager, he kept the room tidy and immaculate, enjoying his high-fidelity audio system, records, and radio. His family was startled when he requested that his walls be painted purple, but they had it done right away. Brian was born Brian Samuel, September the 19th, 1934. He was the firstborn son. His parents were very proud, and they now had an heir apparent to the family company. He was born on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, the holiest holiday in the religious calendar. When Brian was 6 months old, a nanny was hired. Alma Johnson noted how he was a determined child, spotless in hygiene and dress, and as a baby he hardly cried. When he was a toddler, he played in the garden, and he wanted to get clean right away afterwards. He disliked his nanny's authority. Once he misbehaved on the bus and she made him get off and walk home. He sulked and walked away from her, but he never bore malice. Clive John was born 22 months after Brian, and Brian wasn't an early riser, but Clive was always ready to go in the morning. Brian as a toddler was demonstrative, and Clive was better organized and more precise in his dress. Relatives thought that Brian would be an actor and Clive would take over the family business. Harry wanted Brian and Clive to make their way and not suffer poverty. When the Beatles became world famous, the Liverpool Jewish community was filled with pride that their local boy was the group's mentor. One letter Brian wrote while at school, he said he wanted to be a dress designer. Brian's father thought it was too artsy to even consider, and he asked Queenie what she thought. She understood Brian, but she thought it was impractical. She said we had friends in the fashion business, but they were no Christian Dior's. Queenie said we weren't enamored with the idea. In a letter home, Brian said he couldn't be a dress designer or an artist. He would join his father's firm. He would groan, but he would be out of education. Harry's father would have preferred Brian to stay in school, but his ultimate ideal was to have both his sons work alongside him. He agreed Brian could leave school in 1950, and he was 16 years old. Clive stayed in school, and Brian started to work. Brian was expected to get to work by 9 a.m. and apply himself to stock checking, furniture display, and sales duties. Grandfather Isaac set an example, and sometimes he arrived at the shop by 6 a.m. Brian tried to make the best of it. He had charm, and he made his mark as a successful salesman. His father believed that both he and Brian made the correct decision. Finding his niche, Brian started to assert himself, and he introduced revolutionary displays of furniture into the window. He thought the existing ones were cluttered and disorganized. Grandfather Isaac had achieved good profits through straightforwardness, and he didn't like the creative revolution that Brian was coming up with. He lectured Harry, so there were 3 generations with different ideas, so they were bound to clash. Brian's father decided that his son needed a touch of independence in his training. After 2 years of fragile relationships at Walton Road, Harry arranged for him to take a 6-month apprenticeship at Times Furnishing in Lord Street, Liverpool. Brian would shine there. His perfect manner was praised, and his originality and window displays welcomed. He was getting perfect reports on his progress, and he was making £5 a week. His parents were delighted that at last his life seemed purposeful. He even started to take lessons of French and Spanish at home. Brian didn't like being at home and dependent. His social life started to thrive. He was 18 and Liverpool's best-dressed bachelor. His clothes came from top tailors, and he found himself popular among girls. He blushed in their company. He mixed in a largely Jewish circles, and he enjoyed the animated company of people his own age at parties and restaurants and bars. Brian got along with his father's neighbor and friend, Rex Mencken. He said Brian was a handsome young man, well-dressed, and very, very temperamental. He said Brian was artistic, volatile, mercurial, and flamboyant. He said that Brian's father was not highbrow. He was warm and jolly and fun-loving person. Harry loved Brian, and he felt like he was a shining angel, no matter what trouble Brian might have caused him. Harry was proud of Brian and supportive. Mencken said that Harry was a good man, and Queenie, he thought, was a good woman. They couldn't understand Brian. Brian pursued paths that the neighbor said didn't approve of, and he drank too much. Brian resented his background. He was very talented, but a misfit in society. He thought that Brian drank to find solace. When Brian was 18, he was conscripted for national service. He wanted the Royal Air Force, but he didn't get it. In December 1952, he was ordered into the Army for the statutory 2 years. He went through 6 weeks of physically tough training in the Royal Army Service Corps in Aldershot. He was assigned as a documentation clerk. Brian didn't like being in the Army, and he was bitterly disappointed when he failed tests for officer candidacy. The author states that this piece of self-delusion was incredible. He loathed the Army and all its discipline. He had no interest in physical work, yet firmly believed that his background and composure qualified him for officer status. Disliking military discipline, he would have been weak at instilling it in others. Brian had a permanent posting in Taunton, Somerset, and he nagged his superiors for a more interesting location. Finally, he got to go to Albany Barracks, Regent's Park, London. There he could make evening and weekend visits to his London aunts and uncles. To Brian, as to all other 18 years old at that time, national service was an irreverence, an imposition on his time. He was a misfit from the start. Queenie said Brian loved his comforts too much to be any kind of institutional situation. A perk, though, of being in London was that he got to see the latest plays and films, and he would dress in a bowler hat, pinstripe suit, and an umbrella. It was hardly the appearance of a private, more of an off-duty officer. One Friday, returning from his aunt's house in which he was dressed up, the private soldiers thought he was an officer. An officer, though, recognized Brian and told him to report to company office at 10 in the morning. He was charged with impersonating an officer. Brian was flabbergasted. It was a trumped-up charge, and he was confined to barracks for a week. Then he was sent for medical and psychiatric tests, and after 10 months in the Army was told that he would be discharged immediately. After seeing Brian's nerves frayed, the doctors deemed him emotionally and mentally unfit for continued service. The ejection gave him freedom. The discharge certificate described him as hard-working clerk who uses his initiative and can in very respect be depended upon to see a job through satisfactorily without supervision. Of smart appearance and sober habits at all times, he is utterly trustworthy. So Brian returned to his sanctuary of Liverpool. At home, his parents had installed a telephone in each of their sons' bedrooms to enhance their privacy. Brian bought classical music records every week, building up his collection in the cabinet that was made specifically for him at Queenie's father's factory in Sheffield. Brian's father's business was flourishing. Harry decided that the piano and sheet music sold at North End music stores and annexed to his furniture store should have records too. Who better to handle this than Brian, who had a strong knowledge of classical music? The idea was an instant success. And soon Brian took charge of another part of Harry's expanding operations, Clarendon Furnishing and Hoylake. Harry thought that Brian had a creative talent, so why not have him work in the more aesthetically conscious part of Merseyside rather than in the hard-headed Liverpool? Brian was a success there too. The Hoylake operation was profitable within a year. Harry was happy that Brian was settling down. Brian liked the challenge of the Hoylake shop, and to Queenie, Brian was beautiful and dutiful. He was sensitive and thoughtful towards his mother. Every week he brought her rum truffles from Thornton's. That was the confectioner's next door to the North End music stores. Brian loved to ride horses, and that had begun at Beaconsfield School, and this helped him to bond with his father. He liked a day at the races. Occasionally they went together to Chester or Liverpool races, where Harry was impressed with Brian's judgment of horses in the paddock. Brian also visited the tennis clubs, and there was a holiday romance with a girl named Joan Starkey. Brother Clive was in the Royal Army Education Corps and had become a sergeant. Brian had dozens of acquaintances but few close friends. He was uncomfortable with large crowds, a trait that would linger. He was generous. At 19, he gave his mother, who loved books, as a birthday present, an annual subscription to Harrod's book department, which continued all his life. He enjoyed giving gifts regularly: cufflinks to his father, a gold and diamond brooch to his mother, castanets to a neighbor's children after a Spanish holiday. Brian was troubled by his homosexual life. He decided he had to tell his parents, and he chose a Friday night after dinner with his parents and Clive at Queen's Drive. Queenie said he told us, and she went right up to him and hugged him. Then Brian ran to his bedroom. Harry and Clive were shocked. Queenie less so, being a mother. She had some suspicions for some time. She said nevertheless it was a shock. And she went to talk to Brian the night after. And Harry went to see him, and he couldn't quite accept it the way that she did. Harry thought that it was too much fuss was being made about it, though. After that night, Brian found solace in talking to Queenie about his inner self. She was the only one who could engage him in therapeutic conversation. The rest of his family was off limits. Queenie said that his secret years of homosexuality affected his character and made him very mixed up. He wasn't happy with it. His love affairs were disastrous. She would tell him, "Brian, why can't you find somebody congenial to spend your life with?" She meant a man, and I was sure he could find happiness, but he was so unhappy. Brian's private life filled him with guilt. He appeared to many girls a most eligible bachelor. Others more knowingly, sarcastically dubbed him the Immaculate Deception. He was comfortable in female company, and homosexuality was illegal in those years. Brian never allowed his night pursuits to affect his work. He was industrious like his grandfather and his father. Once Brian was a success at something, he became bored, and it happened with the Hoylake business. Brian, he went to the theater all the time, and he usually went by himself, and he went to all the productions. He thought about becoming an actor. An actress told him, "Although I think you're sweet-looking and charming, you haven't got a leading actress face. You're not going to get the leading man parts." But Brian still wanted to continue. Brian told Queenie what he wanted to do, and she identified with his artistic trends. Harry thought it was another idiotic scheme. Helen thought that he was totally unnatural. She felt it would be hard to get him past his first audition. He was tense and stiff in his movements unrelated to his speech, and she worked with relaxation exercises. Brian was still determined, and he came to each lesson and he knew his lines. He was aiming high at Henry IV or Henry V, and she said no firmly. The best chance he had was to avoid any heroism. She told him not to play Hamlet or Romeo or any of the classic parts. To the amazement of everyone except for Epstein, he passed his audition in London on his 22nd birthday, September the 19th, 1956. Brian was asked to audition to read some portions of T.S. Eliot. Harry agreed to pay for the academy fees. He didn't think it was a manly career, so Brian was at RADA, and his contemporaries there were Susanna York, Peter Blythe, and Hugh Whitmore. A student there with Brian at the time said he was a passive actor, not without ability, but not star material. Brian, he got a steady girlfriend who was in his classroom. She was 20 years old, her name Joanna Dunham. 2 years younger than Brian. They went to the cinema and art exhibitions together. Socially, he drank too much, and very few of the RADA students did that. It was the coffee bar era. And once he took Joanna to a party, he got drunk there, and she didn't like him because he had changed slightly when drinking. He wanted to drive her home, and she wouldn't let him. She said they would have been smashed to bits. She said she ran off into the night and got a taxi. She thought he had a problem, and it turned her off him a lot after that. She never guessed that he was homosexual. They had an affectionate friendship. They kissed and held hands. And Brian, he was in at least 6 plays, but his acting stance was stiff. Joanna felt that he didn't have much potential, and Brian realized it too. He also didn't like the teacher's discipline. When one of the teachers came in, they all had to stand up and say good morning, like they were in a Victorian primary school. Brian was 22, and he had to act like a young schoolboy. He told Joanna that he hated working at his parents' furniture business, so she was surprised when he didn't start the autumn term in 1957. During the holidays at home, he confessed to his parents that he didn't want to return to London or RADA. He would stay in Liverpool. Brian felt that he had had his chance to break out, and now he had to accept the result and fit in. Being in London away from home, Brian went to one of the drama students' parties and developed an affinity with rock and roll music of American singer Little Richard. Brian stayed in touch with Joanna Dunham, sending her flowers on her first nights as she secured success as an actress. So I will stop the video here. In this episode, we got to see that Brian didn't like school and decided to work in his father's shop. Then he had to go into service, and not becoming an officer and being set up on charges of impersonating an officer, he was released from service. After finding success in his father's shops, he got bored and wanted to try out acting. He did a few plays and realized, along with everyone else, that he wasn't cut out for that. He also told his parents and brother about his homosexuality, and his mother was understanding, but his father and brother were more shocked. So we got to see his personality through these years and what gave him the drive to find his way to the Beatles and find them success. And I can't wait to see what happens next. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And also, I have some merchandise that I found on Amazon site. Well, in the descriptions part of my video, you'll see the merchandise. So if you see something you like, just click on the link and it'll take you to the Amazon site. And if you buy something, I get a small commission at no extra cost to you. More importantly, I wish everybody a great day. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.